Hello, and welcome to the Why podcast from London Business School, where faculty talk about their research and what it means for you, society, and business. I'm your host, Katie Pisa, and I'm really fortunate today to be joined by Olenka Kacperczyk, Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship here at London Business School. She's done incredible research looking at the gender gap in entrepreneurship, and I'm delighted that she's here to discuss her important research with us today. Olenka, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
In today's episode, we're going to delve into this important topic about the gender gap in entrepreneurship. We are going to examine how startup orientation and investor biases contribute to this disparity and explore actionable strategies to foster equity. Let's start with the big question. Why do female entrepreneurs face such stark funding disparities?
So let me just start off by giving us a broader picture here in terms of how underrepresented women are in entrepreneurship to begin with. So there's few things we are certain of, but one of them is certainly that there is this really stark disparity in both female representation and women's ability to get funding for their ventures. So women, of course, are 50% of the population, but only 20% of all ventures are founded by women. Now, the big news here is that it's actually much worse when we think about certain types of ventures. So when we think about outcomes such as getting VC funding, having valuable acquisitions, or even going IPO. So when you think about these type of outcomes, there things look much, much worse for women. And in fact, 1 in every 10 ventures that get VC backing is female founded. So it truly is a stark disparity, and 20% of that disparity might be attributed to what we consider investors' bias.
So backing up a bit, your research overall shows that female-led ventures are 63% less likely to secure funding than male-led ventures. That's a huge, huge figure, and you've just given some great statistics. But what is behind these numbers, these disappointing numbers?
So the numbers are indeed disappointing. And typically, when we think about factors that might drive this type of disparities, we tend to think about two categories of factors, if you wish. One of them are those what we would call pre-entry barriers. So they pertain to issues like pipeline problems and the question of why is it even the case that women in the first place are less likely to create new ventures, less likely to then create growth-oriented ventures that are going to have all those signals that they do need funding, they are going to raise funding. And so when we think about those pre-entry barriers, so typically you want to think about things like structural constraints. And by structural constraints, we might want to think about inequalities that tend to arise in the workplace, for example. So entrepreneurship, especially when we think about this like creative, disruptive entrepreneurship, ventures that are going to be really interesting and appealing to investors. So for those type of ventures, in order to even launch these ventures, to get them going, to make them valuable and attractive to investors, you need to come across opportunities. You need to be able to mobilize resources. And so that often happens in the workplace. Now, the problem with that is that in the workplace, when we think about women's representation in positions where these opportunities arrive or these kind of resources are going to set, so these are typically upper-level positions, they might be managerial positions, they might be positions of leadership. And unfortunately, what we see is that women face systematic barriers in accessing those type of positions. So they're much less likely to be represented, to occupy those upper-level positions. And so because of that, those opportunities and resources that we need to create those ventures in the first place, they are going to be limited for women relative to men. So that's certainly one problem. Now, you could take it even further and you could say, well, it's not only about this vertical underrepresentation of women in the workplace, it's also about horizontal. And what I mean by this is the fact that we now know that there is a systematic segregation of women across industries, across sectors. So if women do found ventures, and they certainly do become founders, and they often are going to choose this entrepreneurial route versus staying in paid employment, but when they do that, it just turns out that often they are going to explore or exploit opportunities that sit within consumer products, that sit within service type of industries. So because there is that segregation across occupations, we don't see women in high tech, we don't see women in STEM. Ultimately, even if they do create new ventures, they are going to sit within industries that are just less attractive, less appealing to investors to begin with. And so that's a big part of the story.
Sure. But in backing up, can I just ask you, how did you come about doing this research? What led you to this?
This is an excellent question because it cuts straight to my own experience. Growing up, I have been always surrounded by entrepreneurs. My dad is an entrepreneur after the fall of communism. So I grew up in Poland, where after the fall of communism, there's a lot of opportunities, market opportunities to found new ventures. And so my family truly embraced that. At the same time, being surrounded, so both my father and my sister are entrepreneurs, being surrounded by these kind of choices on the day-to-day basis, looking at the struggles and some of the frictions that we see once an individual decides to create a new venture and then also seek resources and seek funding or even hire employees, I kept questioning whether this is the right choice. And if it is, what could we do as a society to make it easier for individuals? And so that really inspired my quest, my interest in the broader topic of inequalities within entrepreneurship.
Were you seeing differences in how your sister and your father were getting funding, for example? Did that sort of spark your first?
I would say absolutely yes. Now, with a big caveat being that the gender gap, both in women representation in entrepreneurship, as well as access to funding, varies dramatically across countries. It varies dramatically across sectors and industries. And so on average, we do see that it's about 20%. But if you ask me about a particular country, in this case, it would be Poland, it might be higher or lower than what we see traditionally in the West. So it's a difficult question to answer. But I would say yes, on average, we do see there's some pockets of advantage that women might have in certain industries, in certain geographies, but overall, we do see that there is that stark disparity.
And this research took place, I think it's over 16 years of the time period of what you looked at in California and Massachusetts.
That's right.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? How do you even come about choosing, the amount of years and the geographic location? Is that because they're both high startup areas?
Absolutely. So both Boston and Massachusetts, as well as the U.S., are contexts in which you would see a higher representation of growth-oriented ventures that actually do get VC funding, ventures that are going to potentially go IPO or have high-value acquisitions. And so it's a fantastic context to study and understand how the barriers that we traditionally think about in entrepreneurship, especially for women, how that might play out differently when we think about high growth ventures. And so the context is fantastic. Now, the challenge, of course, is that if you study this kind of question, you do need really extensive data. Again, if we are to draw any conclusions, we need to be able to look at systematic patterns over time across different industries, across different populations. And so in this case, we were able to look at every single business that was ever registered in the United States over a very long time. In addition, so let me just point out, because this is what I'm most proud of for this research, whenever you're thinking about understanding the drivers of disparities in funding. So your initial question, why is it that women are less likely than men to get funding in the first place? So the biggest challenge here is to think about ventures that are created by a woman versus a man that are otherwise observationally equivalent. Because we know that there is a selection and women tend to found ventures that are dramatically different in many respects, and that might already explain part of the story. And so if we are to really think about, well, what about investors per se? So we need to hold everything else the same. And so in this project, we're able to do that to some extent. It's not perfect, but at least to some extent, we were able to take every single business that was registered in the United States. We identified the founder, their gender, but beyond that, we were also able, and that was really important for us, we're also able to account for what we called entrepreneurial quality. And these are all the differences, if you wish, in things like, do I have patents? Do I have trademarks? Did I register in Delaware, which in itself signals an intention to growth? And so because
Delaware is sort of the capital of where?
Absolutely, yes. So that's in the United States. A lot of high growth ventures would be registered there. We even looked at things like the name. Is the name, is the business named after the founder, or does it have a more professional name? So anything you can observe so that we could kind of take it and set it aside and say, okay, well, this explains, it turns out in this project, this explains 75% of the differences. So the initial choices of whether I'm going to have patents, I'm going to signal to everyone that I have this high growth venture. So all of those taken together, we found, explained 75% of disparities between men and women founded ventures in getting funding.
That must have been a massive amount of research. How many businesses were registered in the U.S.? Do you remember the exact number?
I do not remember the exact number, but it's millions and millions.
Millions.
Yes. We're talking about millions because this is the universe of businesses. So it includes mom and pop shops. It also includes ventures that are ultimately going to get VC funding. And those are probably about between 1% and 2% of our sample. So very, very few to begin with.
Sure. You talk a lot about, in your research, how women, the three stages of entrepreneurship, the initial founding stage, the capital seeking stage, and then the exit stage. And I think one thing that really hadn't been looked at in depth are at the various stages. And that's what you wanted to also touch on in your research, which I found very interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about what that showed and which stages you focused on? How did you go about that?
Absolutely. So thank you for bringing that up, because I do indeed agree that this is one of the value added of this particular research, is that we can actually look at the entire pipeline from founding to raising capital to really exiting. And so because we can kind of map out the entire journey, we are able to see what is the actual attrition through this funnel. So what happens as you go further down the funnel, as you go further down the pipeline, what happens to these numbers? And so unfortunately, what we found, it turns out that the farther you go in the funnel, the more unfavorable the outcomes for women. So as I mentioned at the beginning, 20% of all ventures are being founded by women. However, once you actually get VC funding, so among all the VC-backed ventures, only 10% are founded by women. And then once we go one step further even, and we think about what happens when you IPO, so how many of those have a female founder? That's only 7%. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's only by looking at the entire trajectory that we are able to fully realize the extent of attrition.
It's really interesting and still discouraging,
and
but
depressing.
It's great and depressing. Yes, exactly. I want to talk to you a little bit about how societal norms and expectations shape startup orientation for women.
This is a big question and a very important question as well, in part because it's difficult to study and it's difficult to fix. Maybe that's the more important point. In general, when we think about, it goes back to this question of why is there a gap at the investment stage? So once we think about, well, let's look at ventures that are comparable. For men and women, we're looking at ventures that are roughly look the same. Why is it that investors would discount women? And they would discount them quite dramatically. And so this is where some of the societal norms and gender stereotypes come in. They're not the only reason. They're not the only factor that would explain this disparity. But based on my research, I do believe that plays an important role, those gender stereotypes. And so why are those stereotypes important, should you ask? I think what we're seeing is that the traditional gender roles, whereby women are seen as being more burdened with childcare, being required to a greater extent than men to accommodate family needs. So those type of traditional gender roles, the cultural beliefs about those roles, are often seen as incongruent, incompatible with the role of a founder. They're being seen as incompatible with being an entrepreneur because it turns out, and there's a lot of research to support this, that entrepreneurship is often seen as what we call a male-typed activity. So when we think about entrepreneurship, we immediately think about leadership. And when we think about leadership, we immediately associate it with masculine qualities. Now, unfortunately, women are often seen as lacking leadership qualities, in part because, as I said at the beginning, they are systematically underrepresented in upper-level positions within the workplace. We also don't have a lot of political leaders. And so there is that cultural belief that when you think about a leader, you think of man. You immediately think of man. And women, by contrast, are often seen as more agreeable, more compliant. Now, this poses an important challenge for entrepreneurship because just at the very pure level of stereotyping and kind of understanding or signaling here, investors might rely on some of those stereotypes, especially that entrepreneurship is what I call a low information environment. So you don't have a lot of information. Gender is going to be salient. We tend to associate gender with the lack of leadership qualities. And so that's partially the problem that's creating that large gap in venture funding.
So your research, as we said earlier, it touches on these investor biases and you really highlight this. And though we want to think we've come some distance from, 50 years ago, it doesn't feel, when I hear the numbers, it doesn't seem that way.
And to put the actual numbers to it, we looked at least in our research, the period wasn't as long. Nevertheless, just to highlight this fact, we do not see any change over time. So between at least 1995 and 2011, the trend is very stable. There's no uptick. And so at least within that period, nothing has changed. Now, it might be a little bit different now, but it takes a long time, it seems.
Absolutely. Can you share a real world example illustrating these challenges? Was there a case study that you came upon that would be interesting to know about?
There are many different instances where women are faced with those systematic barriers when seeking funding or just even launching the ventures to begin with. Let me highlight one example which I find particularly telling, and it's not coming from a particular company. It is coming from research, and in particular, the research was based on a pitching competition. In the pitching competition, it turns out that investors, when inquiring about the potential of a venture, they tend to ask very different questions to women and men founders. And in particular, what this research shows is that when you think about threats versus opportunities, and so you think about asking questions that are more focused on promotion and opportunities versus prevention and threats, it turns out that during pitching competition, and that's a real event that this research explored, during this pitching competition, investors were much more likely to ask prevention-focused questions of women founders. So, are you going to fail? They were worried about the potential threats disproportionately relative to what they were asking of men founders. Now, this was really important because it turns out that just by the sole virtue of asking those very different questions, that already had an influence on how much funding these women were raising. And so if we think about just purely pitching competitions, I've been involved in some of them. One thing you notice time and time again is that indeed the questions are being very, very different when it comes to women and men founders. And so that's an interesting instance of how these barriers are present, even when you don't tend to think about them, even when you don't realize that someone is asking you a very different questions, they are there.
So systemically, the questions already put the female person in a defensive role where
That's
you
exactly
have to prove why you're not going to make a mistake,
Exactly.
whereas the man is maybe given the opportunity to show what kind of opportunities and successes they may have. So,
and that impacts the overall evaluation of the venture and the funding you're going to get.
I want to move on to the fact that it's not all doom and gloom, as we've said. There are some incredible stories of women breaking barriers and leading high-growth ventures. Mm-hmm. What are some key factors driving those success stories?
And we hope that there's more and more of those success stories. Absolutely. I would say one of the main advances that we are seeing is this change in stereotypes. And so if you think about the norms or these traditional associations of women with feminine qualities that tend to be then incompatible with being a leader, with being a founder, I think increasingly we're seeing a shift. And there are some examples of that. So when you think about how this could happen, one of the factors that really matters is role modeling. And so I think increasingly we are seeing that there's more role models, both at the kind of more local level when we're thinking about having a female manager, having a woman who has been an entrepreneur and she's going to hire and train women who are then going to have that role model. We know that already is fostering entrepreneurial rates.
So I was going to ask you, mentorship initiatives are helping this bridge the gap.
Mentorship is one of them, and I would say even more, it's just a pure shift in norms and associations of women being able to take those leadership positions. And one thing that comes to mind as well here is the role of political leaders. So in certain countries, so that's Mexico and South Korea come to mind. These were the countries in which you would see the rise of women to political positions. So we had a female president in Mexico and in South Korea. And so there are studies that show, one of them is actually mine, subsequently in South Korea, there was a rise in female founders, in part because those traditional stereotypes about women not being fit or legitimate as leaders, that started shifting. And so the moment you operate in a male-dominated environment, but you are able to have some breakthrough when it comes to women's representation in leadership positions, that turns out to be making a huge difference to female representation at the entrepreneurial level.
So women feel more empowered if they have a great role model.
They feel more empowered. They feel more confident. There's more of a can-do attitude as well. So there's that self-reinforcing feedback loop. Because the barriers are being reduced, now all of a sudden women feel more confident that this is something they can actually do and the society is going to be receptive to it.
Can I ask you one more question on this? Why is representation in leadership and investment circles crucial for improving this gender gap?
So absolutely. One mechanism through which it happens is because it does impact what we call the supply side, women's motivation, confidence, their interest in entrepreneurship in the first place. So that's clearly the most powerful mechanism through which we can get this very nice self-reinforcing loop. Now, another mechanism as well is that, to the extent that women might indeed be less experienced or as we said at the beginning, data shows that women are not as represented in STEM or in high tech. So to the extent that they might need more training, more mentorship, having this representation on the side of investors, for example, could really help by providing the resources that women really need. Because part of the issue is also about allowing women to acquire the knowledge and resources that we know disproportionately lack. And so this is where training programs, providing resources, support, mentorship, all of those is going to make a huge difference. Now, I will say there's a caveat to it. There's very interesting paper, very interesting research that shows that when growth-oriented ventures founded by women start raising funding from female investors, that might counterintuitively reduce their chances of getting subsequent funding in subsequent rounds. And so this research shows that the mechanism behind this is the inference that women were favored by other women. So we also have to be careful in how things actually are being projected and how they are being perceived.
So that could actually backfire.
Exactly.
If that does happen.
That's right.
I'm just fascinated. You have a lot of research. You've done a lot of research. Just curious, because that's what London Business School is all about. How many research papers might you have going on at one time? Is it possible that you have more than one?
Absolutely. Yeah. The magic number is 12.
Oh, my goodness.
But don't quote me on that. It varies.
Oh,
yes.
Wow.
Yes, it's
okay.
definitely simultaneous projects at the same time. What's really nice is that, of course, in this kind of situation, you do have one question that leads to another question and another project. So there is there's a chain. It's a chain. That's how we should be thinking about it.
Sort of constant curiosity, which leads to another subject matter that you want to then look into.
And sometimes you don't have all the data that you wish, and so therefore you need to collect more data to answer a question from the previous project. And so that's how they become all interlinked.
Hats off to you. I don't know how you managed to do that much research, but you obviously have the mind for it. Why is gender equity in funding critical for fostering innovation and economic growth?
Why do we care about entrepreneurship? Why do we want more entrepreneurs in our societies? It's because entrepreneurship is the engine of innovation, disruption. It is also an engine of job creation. A lot of employment comes not only from mature, but also entrepreneurial firms. And so if that's true, if we really care about increasing the rate at which new ventures are being founded, then we should be getting larger pool of people who are engaged in it. Women are 50% of our society, but only 20% of all ventures are founded by women. And so to me, that raises a question of where are those missing entrepreneurs? Where are those missing female entrepreneurs? And what can we do to have them be part of building that ecosystem? Because, of course, what we also know is that if we are going to build entrepreneurial ecosystems, they do rely to a large extent on the involvement of many diverse individuals, because these individuals have different ideas, they bring different perspectives. That's how innovation happens. That's how recombination happens. And so if we are going to leave half of the society from this, then obviously the overall value we're going to create is going to be much more limited. And so,
less representative of society as a whole.
Absolutely. It's less representative. And on top of that, there might be a woman Einstein out there, and we need to get her in. We need to be thinking about how to make it more equally distributed. I will also say that more specifically, if we actually leave women out of that, if they're not participating, one very concrete problem is that there are going to be certain sectors, certain areas, let's say women health, where women might bring more experience. So it's called femtech these days. They do bring more experience. They do bring more knowledge. We as a society are going to create fewer solutions in that space unless we can increase women's participation. And so the question is not if, the question is how can we do it? How can we address the problem of those missing women entrepreneurs?
What can policymakers do more, industry leaders and policymakers, investors, do more to help support female entrepreneurs?
A lot.
What would be your top three things of advice for them to help?
Absolutely. So the first simple solution where you get a large bang for the buck is that we need to make sure that we provide not only resources, so not only the financing that we talked about, but also time. We also make it more manageable for women because unfortunately women do often face a disproportionate childcare responsibility. They do have that other duties.
Motherhood
penalty, absolutely. And so the question there is, what can we do not only at the level of let's give women more resources, but also how can we help them manage their time? And so there's many different ways in which policies can help address this issue. They can help lower the time needed to found a new venture. And so let me just bring in a very interesting example, which was a focus of one of my studies. So in Portugal, a few years ago, there was an initiative at the policy level to lower the cost of founding a new venture. And so that cost includes two pieces. One of them was, let's just make it cheaper for everyone to go ahead and found their venture. So instead of needing 2,000 euros, you now need only 200 euros. So it's much, much cheaper. Now, more importantly, that reform also said, well, now you don't need as much time to register your venture because prior to the reform, you had to go to many different offices in Portugal. You would spend weeks and weeks doing paperwork. But after the reform, it was 2 hours. You could incorporate online. You just go online, you do www, and you're done. And it turns out in the project where we looked at the impact of this kind of reform on female transition to entrepreneurship, what we found was that women disproportionately benefited. And the reason why they disproportionately benefited was because all of a sudden they could do it really fast. They had the time to be able to become founders. And so one very simple way to really foster, to increase the rate of women's entrepreneurship is to lower the time, is to lower the administrative barriers that prevent people from entering.
Have any other countries done such similar initiatives? Or is it Portugal a great example of?
There has been a lot of so-called deregulation reforms. So these are the reforms that would lower the barriers to entrepreneurship, either in terms of funding or in terms of the administrative burden. I think Mexico is another country that had a similar reform. Probably my next context to study what happened there. Although in Mexico in particular, there is a study that shows that when those barriers decreased, Mexico in particular is what's called like a patriarchal society. And so what happened there was that a lot of women quit their wage jobs. They paid employment to help along their husbands who now became founders. And so there was another form of inequality that was created because the barriers to entrepreneurship were lowered.
So reducing the barriers, making things more efficient for women to go ahead on the administrative side and get things going. Is there anything else that you could suggest or recommend that policymakers or leaders think of?
Absolutely. Another important and powerful tool, I think, is to create those role models. So we as a society, we now know that having women be more represented in leadership positions is going to be it's going to induce a dramatic change. It is going to help at various levels to attract women to entrepreneurship, to make it more feasible for them. And so there are instances in which you might think about even having pre-mandated quotas for women in leadership positions. And I'm specifically thinking even about political leadership, not only corporate leadership, but political leadership. And so to the extent that we as a society and policy might partially influence some of those as well, the moment we start having a much higher representation of female political leaders, that might set in motion that very nice self-reinforcing loop where women will be more encouraged, there'll be fewer stereotypes because they're more represented, because they're being seen more as leaders. And so it's hard to do, but I think the payoff would be quite substantial in this case. So that is certainly a tool that we, I think, as a society should be thinking about. In addition, there's also this idea of thinking about how to transmit the aspirations for entrepreneurial careers within families. Because ultimately, entrepreneurship is a career choice.
I was going to say, are some women naturally more encouraged to start their own business because they've had an example of their family doing the same?
That's exactly right. Mine was the opposite. I thought I would never be a founder, seeing what it entails. But you might absolutely expect this dynamic of career transmission within families. And so we know at the level of research that when it comes to not entrepreneurship, but inventorship. So when we think about women inventors, and there's a similar problem of women being underrepresented as inventors who patent, as inventors who license. And it turns out that a large reason for this disparity is because within families, parents, to the extent that they might actually even want their children to pursue this type of career, they always favor boys. They always favor men. Why? Why do they favor men? Well, it's because they anticipate that inventorship is going to be a much harder, much more difficult career for women. So again, there could be many reasons why that transmission of inventorship or entrepreneurial career is disproportionate to boys than to girls. But one of them is that some parents might anticipate that it's going to be harder. And so they're going to shelter girls and women from these traditionally male dominated professions, which I think at some level it hurts us all. It hurts us as a society. And so very early on, we can already foster that transmission of entrepreneurial values and aspirations within families even.
But it seems to be getting better. I mean, I feel as if, I don't know, I'm from the US and I see a lot of family businesses where the daughters are given a lot of opportunity to take over the family business or to go to a business school or whatever, to follow in the lead of maybe something their father set up. And it is encouraging. And I think times are changing. So we can be hopeful.
We can be hopeful. And I think we need more data now to see what is happening to those trends, those disparities that we documented up till 2011. So it might be a little bit different now. Absolutely. And I hope it would.
One question we ask all of our guests at the end is, now what can we do? What can we do to activate some changes that we've discussed today?
There is a lot each of us can do to support female entrepreneurs. If you're a manager in a company, if you're running a startup, do think about hiring women to provide them with opportunities and resources to become a founder. If you're a voter, think about electing female leaders, either at your local level or your national level, because that will have profound consequences for women's motivation, willingness, self-confidence when they try to decide whether to become founders. So my overall message is let's make sure that we're forgiving, but we also offer a lot of support for women entrepreneurs so that in the future it's not even a topic. It's no longer a challenge. And we truly do generate this level playing field for everyone in entrepreneurship.
Thank you so much for this really important work you're doing. And as a woman, I want to say I support you and hope that we won't be having this conversation maybe in some years ahead. It won't even be a topic for all of us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And now a question for our audience. Why do you think the gender gap in entrepreneurship is so important? Join the conversation on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X by following us on #TheWhyPodcast. You can also get more information by going to london.edu/think/the Why Podcast.